Hello, I'm Jan Czerwiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. On this episode, we take a hard look at the flaws in the European part of the NATO alliance. With Washington's change of strategy regarding Moscow, Europe is left to think, we're all in this together, right? This is why we're going to unpack what a European-centric NATO could look like without extensive American support. Does it have what it takes to not only support Ukraine, but also keep its borders intact? Let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
This is the most successful and most powerful military alliance in history, NATO. In the eyes of many, it is the very reason why Western countries have enjoyed peace for the last several decades. It is not an overreach to say that it is led by the United States. After all, Washington contributes most to its defense and runs the nuclear sharing program, which guarantees the security of other members. Recently, however, the American president has begun using critical rhetoric towards the alliance's other members. Trump has been known to lean into the idea of lessening U.S. presence as part of NATO.
Let's say that NATO is not dead, but Trump has placed it in a retirement home, and this retirement home is becoming a death trap.
But let's say the worst comes to pass, that the US Congress approves American withdrawal from the alliance. It would become, bar Canada, a solely European alliance. Two countries would be looked at to take the leadership mantle.
We have to talk to the British and the French, to both European nuclear powers, about the question of whether nuclear sharing, or at least nuclear safety, could be claimed from the United Kingdom and France.
The United Kingdom is one of them. London has been heavily involved in supporting Ukraine throughout its defense against Russia. Prime Minister Keir Starmer has also shown willingness to lead by example and send peacekeepers to Ukraine as part of an international team. There is just one little problem, though. It is not part of the EU. France is. This is crucial. And NATO without the US military would likely become entwined with the European Union. France is already often seen as one of the two leading countries in the bloc, alongside Germany. If it also takes over a leading role in NATO, it would put itself in a position to perhaps be the leading force on the continent. France has been very critical of the US's dominance in the alliance, as far back as the time of President Charles de Gaulle. A US departure would also force all other members to up their defense spending to fill the vacuum. Poland has already been doing so. It currently possesses one of the most powerful armies in Europe and would be expected to play a vital role in this hypothetical version of NATO as well. Alas, a US withdrawal from NATO seems very unlikely, despite Donald Trump's more critical stance towards it, observers note. Yet it is important for Europe to pull its own weight, should the worst come to pass.
And now, as always, it's time to examine the issue in greater detail. In some critics' view, Europe's idea of defense is as coordinated as a group project where everyone decided to work from home. The United States, meanwhile, is expected to be the overworked babysitter, constantly reminding everyone that they need to pay attention. But is it the truth? Let's look at the details, shall we? All the parts are there: hardware, strategic planning and military preparedness, but they lack cohesion as a collective unit. Consider Europe's strategy, a loosely defined notion of collective defense that sounds impressive. In theory, it's supposed to deter adversaries by promising a united front. And then there is the issue of leadership. In an ideal world, NATO would be a shining beacon of collective decision-making. In reality, it's an alliance where every country gets a seat at the table, but very few get to steer the ship. Now, I'm not saying that NATO's European members don't try. There is plenty of effort made by some nations, like Poland, the Baltic states, and even Greece. The war in Ukraine was also a call to others to modernize their forces, to contribute meaningfully, and to stand up in the face of global threats. But it has not been enough of a wake-up call for some states for whom the war is taking place far, far away. Instead of a united, coherent force, you're left with a mosaic of well-meaning but fundamentally fractured approaches to defense. As we look ahead, the big question remains: How do we transform this patchwork alliance into a truly effective military force? Now, the answer, unfortunately, isn't as simple as a few more summits or even a few more dollars in the defense budget. It calls for a radical rethinking of priorities and a bit of humility. Perhaps it is time for European nations to admit that while they may love their independence, they better think about the future of the transatlantic alliance. They'd better think about it long and hard. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Krzysztof Jaworski, Deputy Director at the Institute for Security and International Development. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you for having me.
So first, let's set the stage for the analysis. It is often said that the end of NATO could be upon us, that the United States could decide to withdraw from Europe completely. Do you think that it is the right approach to begin with such a pessimistic outlook and basically ignore all the options that might be there in between the best-case scenario and the worst-case scenario?
I agree that we need to explore the worst-case scenario because planning based on our forecast is kind of bad. If we bet on the optimistic scenario and it happens, great. But if we bet on optimistic scenario and the worst-case scenario happens, it's a failure for us. We could suffer heavily, including our sovereignty, including our life of our people. So
to be honest, many countries actually did bet on the best-case scenario all the time, assuming the US would protect them.
That's right. They are doing it repeatedly, and it is understandable because betting on the worst-case scenario and having preparations is really costly, and it's a hard decision for politicians because it is impossible to maintain at the same time heavy defense spending and all of social spending. So it's well, these politicians should decide, and for them it is very risky because people can not support them and they will lose power. So that's why such a decision is really hard for them.
But isn't Putin actually counting on this, on the sort of built-in issue of every democracy that democratic leaders need to listen to the people, and sometimes unpopular decisions might not be well received, whereas a dictatorship or any authoritarian state, they might just say, okay, we need to increase production by 200%, and I don't care how you do it, just do it.
That's a part of calculation that Putin, that other Russian strategists made, that after several cycles in democratic countries, they can achieve their goals because of exhaustion and because of lack of strict decisions in these countries. Because democracies act strictly only under danger, and this danger is visible for some countries like Poland because we are geographically closer to Ukraine and the war, and Russia is maintaining hybrid warfare against us. But countries as Germany, as France, as UK, they have other calculations because they feel less in danger directly. So that's the part of calculation that Russia made, and probably they made it correctly to some degree. We will see what will happen next, because now there is another factor in this calculation, and it's pressure from US to make Europe spend more, to make Europe take more of this burden of providing security and deterring Russia.
So at a time of long-range missiles and other means of destruction, it is paradoxical that these countries made these calculations that way. But in any case, let's actually move on to the most difficult and uncomfortable question. How far behind are we as Europe when it comes to defense capabilities?
Well, that's a really hard question because when we look at military conflicts like Ukraine war, it occurs after the war started. So you can plan a lot, you can assess a lot, and then after the war starts, all this assessment and plans could be proven wrong. So I think that the question is about what Europe should do next and what Europe done for the last 3 years. There are some moves and some first steps, but they need to be made faster. They need to be made on a large scale, because if United States withdraws totally or to some degree from its commitment to European security within NATO, Europe will lose gap filler, because US within NATO is gap filler, is providing crucial capabilities and coordinating whole operational whole operations. So it's areas like satellite intelligence, in which Europe is almost totally dependent on US, and assessments are that Europe will need about 10 years to build its own intelligence, satellite intelligence capabilities. It is one of the hardest parts, but in some parts we have already a lot of capabilities or potential to create them in a short term, like 1 to 3 years. It's, for example, unmanned ISR. So, to sum up, it is the question of degree as well, and it is, as we stated in the first question, reasonable to bet on the worst scenario and to prepare for the worst scenario.
So what is the most urgent issue to solve? Because I assume that we may actually suspect that if the US decides to limit its presence, it's going to be boots on the ground first. Like, they are not going to say, okay, we're not going to give you our intelligence capabilities anymore, but they might say, well, we're actually so entangled in the Indo-Pacific, we cannot send troops, for example. So one analysis pointed out that we're 300,000 troops short, and also that US troops actually count for more because of the combat readiness capabilities, command structure, and so on. So it could be more than 300,000. Is Europe ready to provide that, to fill this gap, as you put it?
It will be really hard because of these political problems of decision and unpopularity of this decision. We didn't see yet introducing the military draft in any country after start of Ukraine's war, like in Poland, but it will be reasonable to make it, because having a lot of thousands of citizens after military training makes you much tougher, much harder for aggressor to control your territory or even to maintain a war against
more
you.
Resilient, right?
Yes, more resilient.
How many people are there? I mean, Europe has a massive population. It actually outclasses Russia in terms of population. Isn't it a bit absurd to say, well, 300,000 is going to be a tall order compared to the millions that we actually have? I mean, are we not basing it too much on the reduced expectations of Western Europe, of countries that decided history has come to a close? Right now we're going to live in a period of permanent, perpetual prosperity. No war, no conflict, nothing like that. Shouldn't we basically just abandon this way of thinking and go back to the realism that countries of Central and Eastern Europe have been actually applying in practice for years now?
We should, but it is not easy to make whole societies to change their minds and change their ways of living. As I mentioned, it is the question of abandoning some parts of this comfort of living in Europe, of social spending, of security, and it requires looking ahead in medium or long term, which is really hard. Because it will be much more reasonable, in my opinion, to spend more now to make people up to military training now, to create efficient civil defense now, but if this danger is like 5 years ahead, a lot of people will not see it as a danger. A lot of people will choose to have comfort now and it's not thinking strategically. It's in the big picture.
Well, we do have an extra incentive, right? The question of munitions. We already see that our stockpiles are insufficient. The war in Ukraine requires a greater involvement, and so we're actually accelerating the pace of production. But is it enough at this stage?
Well, it occurred that it was enough to support Ukraine, enough to help it stand against Russia.
Along with the US.
That's right, but Europe as well increases munition production. But if we look and compare it to Europe's economy and potential capabilities, it's a really small part.
So what incentives do you think should be applied in this case? Germany is discussing, for example, releasing the debt brake.
I think that the biggest incentive now, which is already on the table, is what Trump is doing, because he suggested it at first for many years. His first term was as well this message of NATO should increase spending, Europe should be much self-sufficient when it comes to defense. And now, when suggestions didn't work, Trump is doing it in a much tougher way. So I think if something can move Europe toward more self-defense, it's what Trump is doing now. And now it's time for European decision makers, for European societies to take action.
So we have this escape clause on the European level that was agreed upon, essentially that debt restriction rules would be relaxed for countries investing in their military. So again, do you think that this shows that the European Union can see that it cannot allow this to become bogged down in bureaucracy?
I think it's a good step, but it should be followed by many other steps. It's great that this debt thing is now aligned to higher defense spending, but it should be followed by many structural reforms, and there are as well many obstacles, many challenges. The question of why we talk about Europe as a whole. It is not one entity in the meaning of taking decisions. Countries are deciding based on their own interest and their own assessment of security situation. So I think it's highly unrealistic to rely solely on this Europe as a whole entity, and we should maybe focus on something in medium. It's a coalition of willing, of these countries which are already signaling and are willing to take action, and it is more realistic, so I think we should talk more about this, to be precise.
So this also applies to helping Ukraine, which is another matter altogether, but a related one nonetheless. Krzysztof Jaworski was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much.
And now we move on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Turkey says it could join a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine, but only if it would be included in all the preparations. This comes after Ankara has also been offering to become a mediator in the potential peace talks between Ukraine and Russia.
Turkey is continuing its policy of involving itself in the resolution to the war in Ukraine. The possibility of Ankara sending troops as part of a broader peacekeeping force to Ukraine was reportedly discussed during President Erdogan's meetings with both Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. There is a caveat, however. Anonymous sources say that Turkey would only take part in this mission if it were involved in all the necessary consultations and preparations regarding it. The timing of this report comes as the new US administration has been pushing for Europe to bear more responsibility for its own and Ukraine's security. President Donald Trump has shown support for European NATO members taking part in such a peacekeeping mission, but has ruled out Washington's involvement.
Russians are reportedly admitting that Moscow's invasion of Ukraine has made life harder for them. More than 50% of Russians say that their daily lives have been negatively affected by the war.
A recent poll by Chronicle shows that 54% of Russians claim to have felt the adverse effects of Russia's war in Ukraine. Only 9% of them say that the war has in fact improved their lives. 32% say that they haven't noticed any particular impact. Observers point out that the poll shows growing dissatisfaction with Russia's economic situation among its citizens. Ever since the invasion, which started in February 2022, Russia has been hit with package after package of Western sanctions. The country has shifted to a wartime economy. These factors combined have resulted in, among other things, a very high inflation rate in the country. Many Western companies have also left Russia, depriving Russians of access to popular brands and products which they had hitherto enjoyed.
A report by Bloomberg claims that Washington and Moscow are looking into working together when it comes to trade routes in the Arctic. Such projects were apparently discussed during the recent US-Russia talks in Saudi Arabia.
Sources familiar with the talks in Saudi Arabia say that Washington views this potential cooperation as a way to divide Beijing and Moscow when it comes to Arctic projects. Nonetheless, it is apparently unlikely to succeed due to the so-called no-limits nature of the partnership between China and Russia in this regard. It is also unknown which projects exactly were discussed at the talks, but in addition to trade routes, joint rescue exploration had also been floated. Russia and the US are among the 8 Arctic nations. China declared itself a near-Arctic state in 2018. In the past, Washington warned of the blooming partnership between Moscow and Beijing when it comes to projects in the region. The proposal at the Saudi Arabia talks wouldn't be the first time that the US has flirted with some sort of partnership with Russia in the Arctic. In 2012, the US's ExxonMobil oil giant had partnered with Rosneft to invest in Arctic and Black Sea oil exploration. The American company withdrew from the venture in 2018 because of the Western sanctions imposed on Russia following its illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014.
Kazakhstan has selected the site for its first nuclear power plant. Now the question remains who will build it, with Russia being the frontrunner.
The power plant near the village of Oken will be a monumental step for Kazakhstan when it comes to solving what its president called an energy deficit. It is the first out of 3 reactors which Kazakhstan plans to build over the next few years. The contract for the first plant will be awarded by the end of 2025. Kazakh delegations have visited 4 countries to review various construction proposals. The most recent was put forward by Russia's Rosatom in January and is widely seen as the most probable choice for Astana. Nevertheless, there have been recent reports that a bidder from the United States is interested in entering the tender. This doesn't necessarily concern the Oken reactor, but one of the other ones planned for construction. The US has shown strong interest in bolstering ties with Central Asian countries such as Kazakhstan in an attempt to cultivate productive trade relationships relating to the region's vast natural resource reserves.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and features. I'm Jonasz Rawiński. Bye for now.